I'm not much of a football guy. I grew up witnessing a lot of violence caused by football because, well, Scotland, but despite my abnormal apathy towards it, football is not only a passion to millions of people, but a lifestyle and a borderline religion, especially in Scotland. Every victory is glorious, every defeat is an absolute travesty, and definitely involves some shenanigans on the part of the ref. However, every tragedy is immortal and ever present. Its memory always in the collective consciousness of the people it affected. They don't get to just move on. This is the story of the football tragedy. One that has permeated British society completely. Not just for its body count, but also for its complete blunder and just how avoidable it really was. The Hillsborough Disaster. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get started, a big thank you to Aura for sponsoring this video. Corpos don't really care enough to ensure the safety of their customers, so it's an unfortunate fact that data breaches are a dime a dozen these days. Just recently, AT&T revealed that the records of over 73 million current and former customers were leaked, meaning that data brokers will have an absolute feeding frenzy as they scramble to sell your personal data to scammers, spammers and other assorted ne'er-do-wells. And instead of taking any responsibility or shoring up their defences, all AT&T did was put the onus on those affected by the data breach to protect themselves by suggesting that they use strong passwords, monitor activity on their accounts, and consider credit freezes or fraud alerts from credit bureaus. All a massive pain that involves downloading a bunch of different apps at great expense. If not for Aura, who can do it all for you in one place for a reasonable price. As someone who makes his living and conducts much of his business online, data breaches like those are a massive concern of mine. Especially when you get a notification about a data breach from a website that you never even signed up for. So, Aura provides a lot of peace of mind by flagging the data brokers that sell my information and automatically submit opt-out requests, in addition to stopping spam from hitting my inbox and protecting me from hackers who would use that information to get into my social media or bank accounts. So, if you would like to reclaim your online privacy while supporting my channel, go to aura.com/Dankula or click the link down in the description to get a 14-day free trial and see how much of your personal information has been doxed by data brokers. Before getting into the meat and bones of today's tragedy, I think it would be a good idea to get some background lore on the stadium itself. Our story begins in Sheffield when, in 1899, Sheffield Wednesday FC needed to get a new plot of land to play football on. Their original patch, known as the Olive Grove, was on land that was needed to expand railway lines. As such, the football club was without a football pitch. This may come as a surprise to some of you, but as a matter of fact, a football club needs a football pitch to play football. Lest they end up playing somewhere else, like a McDonald's drive-thru or inside your walls. A solution to this problem presented itself when James Willis Dixon of J. Dixon & Sons, an old money silversmithing company that quite literally helped kick off the Industrial Revolution, offered the team 4 hectares of land at Owlerton in the northwest of the city. Why give the football club a large chunk of land? Well, probably because back then, industrial tycoons and magnates of the day actually cared about their local community. Or they just wanted to pad their egos a little bit. Or more realistically, they just didn't have a use for the land and they wanted the bureaucracy of it out of their hands. Either way, Sheffield Wednesday FC got their land for their new stadium, creatively called Owlerton Stadium. It remained known as Owlerton Stadium until 1914, when it was renamed to Hillsborough Stadium, after some jerryman-jiggery that resulted in the stadium technically falling into the brand new Hillsborough constituency, presumably alongside local fans making an MP very, very happy. With the background founding of the stadium covered, we will skip a bunch of history, because it's all a bunch of who played who stuff that I frankly really couldn't care less about. This timeline skimming brings us to 1989, when the Football Association, the British governing body for all things football related, the Football Feds, if you will, needed a neutral venue to host the semi-finals for the FA Cup between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. So of course, as you expected, Hillsborough Stadium was chosen, with kick-off scheduled for the 15th of April at 3 p.m. With the day and place set, fans and spectators readied themselves for the occasion, presumably stocking up on booze and sing-song slurs to hurl at the opposing team's fans. A proud British tradition. If you haven't heard at least 6 different choruses claiming that you in fact have sex with sheep, then it's just not a traditional game of British football. So, the big day arrives, and fans and onlookers descend upon Sheffield with snacks, drinks, and memorised chants in tow. They are rearing for today's clash of ball-loving kicker men kicking that ball ball-kickingly. I know, I clearly have a vast knowledge of football. Fans began to gather in Sheffield's town centre at around 12 noon, with the overall vibe being described as one of carnival, good humour and expectation. At the back of 2 p.m, we see the fans starting to make their way into the stadium, with mostly Nottingham Forest boys being the early birds and getting the worm. They're set to inhabit the east of the stadium, whilst the Liverpool supporters get the west. This is very important for what happens later. The first batch of about 350 Liverpool supporters arrive later at 2:20 p.m, with the rest of them getting delayed due to roadworks on the M62 motorway. An important note is at the stadium, far more Liverpool fans turned up than Nottingham Forest fans. Even already, the authorities knew that something was off. At around 2:30 p.m, there was a disproportionately large number of spectators trying to get into the stadium outside of the turnstiles facing Leppings Lane, a small stretch of road that feeds into the perimeter gates before going into a tunnel that funnels into the stadium's western pens. Or, in layman's terms, the entire west of the stadium only had a narrow strip of road as its entryway, which meant that it would be very, very cramped even under ideal circumstances. This resulted in pens 3 and 4 being disproportionately overfilled with people. BBC commentator John Motson noticed this irregularity and did his job. Commentated on it whilst pointing a camera at it.
There's gaps, you know, in parts of the ground. Well, you look at the Liverpool end to the right of the goal. There's hardly anybody on those steps. No, to the right of there, that's it. Look down there.
The issue was that not only were the lines congested with spectators who were trying to get in, but there was also people whose tickets were damaged or scuffed and not able to be used, or people who didn't even have tickets and they were just going to try their luck, who were then turning around and trying to leave. But as they tried to leave, they were instead either smooshed against the sides or forced further into the tunnel with this massive tidal wave of people through into the pens. This is what is often referred to as a human crush. And it is in fact not very ideal for any sort of sporting environment because human crushes are extremely dangerous events that must be stopped the moment you see one starting to happen. It shouldn't shock you that this is not the first time that Leppings Lane has hosted a crush before. It's happened on a few separate occasions as a matter of fact. This was made even worse when a supposedly large group of Liverpool fans without tickets showed up and tried to enter the stadium via Leppings Lane. I do somewhat doubt this version of events, but we can get into that later. Why were so many people let in all at once? Well, this was the first of many fuck-ups that led to this disaster. The police had requested the match to be delayed for an hour to give the boys in blue time to either disperse or safely transport the fans inside at an orderly pace. The request was denied. Another fuck-up. So, instead the police opened a reserve gate to help ease the pressure on the people pipe. It sort of worked as well. The only issue was that the excess football fans were funneled into the already crowded stadium, particularly pens 3 and 4. Though they made sure to announce to the people inside the pens to move forward and to the sides to make room for the new batch of fans coming into the stadium. So all that really happened was the massive amounts of fans very quickly filled up these new smaller spaces. So it goes without saying that in the process of averting a human crush, they somehow managed to cause another human crush, except this time with even more people in an even more cramped space. Talk about bungling the trolley problem. By this point, sadly, the crush was in full swing, with men, women and children pressed against the steel fencing of the pen or trampled underneath the sheer massive bodies in the enclosure, with an unnerving amount of footage of people desperately clawing to get over the fences or hoist themselves into the upper pens. Now, there are lots of pictures and footage of this crush happening. But I'm going to be very limited in what we show in this video, because at some points you can see people who are dead, but they are still standing upright because their bodies can't fall over due to the crush, because they're still being held up by everyone else around them. So when you look at the videos and pictures, you can actually spot who is dead. It is extremely distressing, so we're going to try and not show that stuff. But still be warned, the footage that we are going to show in this video is still extremely fucked up. So, just a heads up. At 3:04 PM, Liverpool's Peter Beardsley narrowly missed a goal. The excitement of the near score caused a large chunk of the fans in the crush to lunge forward, either in excitement or in presumed mania. This resulted in the waist-high metal fences throughout the pen to warp and buckle, which caused the people lunging to fall over, which, as you can imagine in a highly compact flesh pit like that, it means that the second you fall, everyone else in a 5-metre radius around you falls as well. And trust me, you do not want to be at the bottom of those dominoes when they fall. Some of the police present see the front fence literally warp with thousands of people being pressed against it, frantically trying to climb over into safety. And in the police's infinite wisdom, they conclude that this isn't people trying to survive, this must be a pitch invasion. So the police apparently started trying to push people back into the pens, not realising just how fucking wrong they got the situation. I mean, you were no more than 10 feet from people who were smooshed against the fence to the point of the fence itself literally warping, screaming at you, pleading to please open the gate. And you just decide, damn, they must really want to get through this fence. Better not let them, we are Britain's best and brightest. I mean, there's shock from witnessing a traumatising situation, and then there's that Gandalf shite. The South Yorkshire police finally managed to realise, judging by the looks on these people's faces, looks of absolute fucking terror, that this might not be a pitch invasion. These look a lot more like people who are trying to not die. So the police tried to end the match by running onto the field and getting the referee's ear. And for once, something like that actually worked, with the match being called off just 5 minutes after kickoff. By this point, it was a mad scramble for the police to clear the way for emergency services on the pitch, whilst contending with the reasonably rising panic in the pens. As people managed to get lifted out, most proceeded to try and organise themselves to help the wounded to the ambulances, which by this point were finally managing to get onto the pitch. The only catch was that there weren't enough stretchers for all of the people that needed ferried. So we had cases of spectators lifting other spectators to the ambulances on torn pieces of advertising boards. However, yet another issue had presented itself sadly. On top of the lack of organisation and the delayed response, most of the ambulances couldn't even get onto the pitch to begin with most ambulances sitting outside of the stadium frantically trying to get the injured outside, which was very, very difficult since most of the exits where the injured were completely packed with people in a human crush. And just like that, within a couple of hours of fans arriving at the stadium, 95 people were dead, with non-fatal injuries estimated to be at 766. Of those who were fortunate enough to survive this event, there were those who were maimed, traumatised and scarred. Some people were even put into comas, and there were some who were clinically brain dead in the following years, alongside those who couldn't cope with the trauma that they had witnessed and sadly resorted to suicide. This was the single largest loss of human life in British football history. And this video should have just ended here. But as we're now going to get into, Hillsborough is sadly not just remembered for the disaster itself. So, what the hell went wrong? Well, it could only be described as a perfect storm of negligence, incompetency, and even as we'll see, a good chunk of malice. We should start with the crux of the issue. The police, who were disjointed at best and were outright hostile at worst. This was down to multiple factors. First of all, command was changed from the previously experienced and totally professional Brian L. Mole to the newly promoted and completely green David Duckenfield, who had, quote, very little if any training or experience in organising a large event like this. And it showed, because police presence in the Leppings Lane was virtually non-existent beyond a handful of plainclothes bobbies and a few cavalrymen mixed in with the walkers. They didn't actually make much of an effort at all to disperse and redistribute the crowds in the lane. And they allowed the crowds to just continue pushing inside, even while they could hear everyone inside screaming. The fact that police present on the pitch at the moment of the big crush weren't even given coherent orders on what to do when people were getting literally minced against the front fences, alongside the indecision with coordinating the ambulance ferrying systems, which was so bad that the ambulance drivers just sat inside their ambulances twiddling their thumbs while people inside were still being crushed and dying. Because the ambulances didn't get told if they were supposed to go in and ferry the injured out, or if the injured were going to be brought to them. So they just sort of sat there waiting for orders that never came. But the story doesn't end there. It gets worse, because of course it gets worse. It always gets fucking worse. As if gross police negligence wasn't bad enough, we get the tried and true excuse of all women. Blame shifting, this time done by the, wait for it my chuddies. That's right my guys, the South Yorkshire Police, yippee, who had the absolute fucking gall to blame this disaster on the fans. Police taking responsibility for their own actions challenge, fucking impossible. Yes, seriously, the police blamed the fans. The police claimed that the side gate that was open to relieve pressure on the turnstiles was actually broken open by a brazen youth or malicious footy fanatic that caused a tidal wave of ticketless heathens to flood the stadium. And during the immediate aftermath, the media just ate that up. Because, of course, the media were eager to spread lies far and wide. That's their job. And this famously resulted in an article from The Sun, ironically titled, "The Truth." The Truth claimed that the event-goers were actively scrapping with the police throughout the disaster, that they were doing shit like rugby tackling PCs whilst they were trying to resuscitate unconscious victims, and that the Liverpool fans were rifling through and pickpocketing the dead. Which sounds absolutely horrible if it weren't for the fact that the entire thing was being broadcasted live on television and that there were cameras literally fucking everywhere. Literally every single moment of the entire thing was caught on multiple cameras from multiple angles, and you can see for yourself that none of that shit happened. Look, it's mainstream media. It's the scorpion and the frog. It's just their nature. Now, surely there is no way that people could reasonably buy into this actually ridiculous amount of slander. Well, they did, but there is a reason for that. Football fans back in the day, especially in the 80s, had a bit of a reputation for rowdy, violent, and overall belligerent behaviour. I mean, they do still sort of have it today, but back in the 60s through to the 90s, well, that was the heyday of the football hooligan. The days of really bad pitch invasions and large-scale fights breaking out before and during the match that looked like a Mountain Blade skirmish. Hooliganism was the culture that spawned the likes of North FC's finest, Big Bazza, and that one movie of Frodo going native. And this, of course, was excellent headline fodder for the entire mainstream media, which, as a result, gave football fans a very negative public image. And the police were all the more eager to use that image as a convenient scapegoat to obfuscate and deflect from their own fuck-up. You know, jangling the threatening aura of the eternal gammon over the public. But it just keeps going, because immediately after the disaster, inquests into the deaths were opened, hoping to bring the officers present to some form of token justice. Only, the inquests were suddenly shut down for seemingly no reason. The inquests were promptly resumed 7 whole months later on November the 19th. Only for the coroner attached to the cases, Dr. Stephen Popper, to turn around and only entertain claims that were before 3:15 p.m. on the day of the tragedy. Because, in his eternal omniscience, he concluded that the victims were all definitely dead. And then he briskly labelled all of them as strictly accidental killings. This made it so that the lives of those who passed away before 3:15 p.m. were considered unable to be saved by the authorities, even if they did do their jobs properly and actually responded to an emergency situation on time in the right manner. So basically, it was a clever piece of bureaucratic fuckery that made every death before 3:15 p.m. not the police's fault. How incredibly convenient. So it shouldn't be surprising in the slightest when the families of the victims and the surviving victims themselves weren't exactly pleased with anything in this case. Imagine being the family of a victim who died, going through the harrowing ordeal of coping with your loved one, getting suffocated beneath a horde of people, trying to get answers as to how they died and what went wrong, only for the coroner to initially deny your request, and then a few months later turn around and essentially say, yeah, they were dead before the police could do anything about it. Sorry. And the kicker? Well, apparently the coroner was known to be rather chummy with the upper crust of the police, you know, hosting dinner parties and such. I love how everyone in the police and government is just such good friends with each other, you know, just what are the chances? And it just keeps on going, because do you remember how I suggested that the senior police officials present during the disaster were wholly incompetent? You know, after all, they bungled basically every duty they were set to perform. Well, it turns out shockingly that people actually agreed. So cue the Taylor report. also known as the Hillsborough Stadium Disaster Inquiry Report. It was, as the name suggests, an inquiry released in January of 1990 meant to look into the disaster by the Lord Justice Baron Taylor of Gosforth. That is to say, he was substantially higher up on the totem pole than the likes of Mole and Duckenfield, and he was not amused in the slightest. It made observations about not only the complete piss take of police procedures, but also of the abysmal state of the stadium itself, like how the gates, pen fences and crush barriers were all found to be severely corroded and deformed. And how Sheffield Wednesday, the owners of the stadium, were told in the past to get the stadium done up before another match, because this wasn't the first time that Hillsborough had experienced a crush. Remember how I mentioned that earlier in the video? Well, on 3 separate occasions in 1981, 1987 and 1988, there were human crushes. That's right, there was a human crush not even a year before this one, and they still thought, nah, it'll be fine. So it should come as a surprise to absolutely none of you that the conclusion to the report in no uncertain terms lays the burden of responsibility squarely on the shoulders of the South Yorkshire Police and Sheffield Wednesday, with it saying, and I quote, "Policing on 15th April broke down." And that is putting it lightly, to say the least. Alongside tearing into the actions or inactions of the police and Sheffield Wednesday that day, the report also presented a series of recommendations on how to avoid this sort of situation from ever happening again. Despite the light words in the report, the consequences of this were staggering. Have you ever wondered why all major stadiums in Britain are seated only? Well, it's probably in part because of this report, as a massive number of stadiums in the country became seating only as a result of this paper. Don't get it twisted, however, because the Taylor report isn't the only paper that was released on this footy fuck-up, because in April of 2009, on the disaster's 20th anniversary, the Hillsborough Independent Panel came into being. That is a little bit of a mouthful, so I'm just going to call it HIP for short. HIP was basically the British government reopening the case with a fresh perspective, and the director's cut, the previously sealed footage, was unearthed and released to the public, including the BBC sports commentary footage that we've been using throughout this video. Naturally, the HIP was a much broader scale retrospective on this disaster due to this wider amount of data on hand, and its findings were shockingly near identical to that of the Taylor report, though there were some interesting caveats that are worth briefly mentioning. The police, in their initial statements, made mention of drunken hooligans kicking in the fence and causing chaos in the crowds on that day. And they maintained this constant theme of alcohol being the main cause of this disaster. The Taylor report hand-waved this, but the HIP didn't. They scoured every single report for any substance to the alcohol claim, and they inadvertently found instead even more shady shit that the police had done. They found that the police not only had the majority of individual police statements collected that day altered so as not to reflect poorly on the police, but they also found out that the police went out of their way to administer blood alcohol tests on all of the victims' bodies, including the children. They did alcohol tests on dead children's bodies to see if they were drunk, so that the police could shift the blame onto the dead children. However much you hate the police, it's not enough. Speaking of the victims' bodies, potentially in response to the HIP's bombshell release, the High Court ordered fresh new inquests to be partook in order to try and actually get a lucid look into the fates of these unfortunate souls. They found that 41 of the 95 victims could have been saved if the police were not so stupid. And in a shocking 12-7 majority, the inquest labelled all 95 victims as being unlawfully killed. Ergo, not an accident. Now for a curveball. One police constable by the name of Maxwell Groom claimed that there was a conspiracy afoot involving a large chunk of the police, involving intrigue, guile and wits, all to shift the blame of this disaster onto Superintendent Roger Marshall. Who's he? Fuck knows, I don't really care, but the supposed mastermind behind this devilish plot is none other than Duckenfield, the inexperienced officer who was overseeing all police activities on that fateful day. Because you see, Duckenfield was a Freemason. Look, there's not been any mention of any three-letter agency so far, so instead we obviously have to shift onto some other shadowy cabal of esoteric elites. I don't know if that conspiracy is true, but Duckenfield was actually an influential member of his local Masonic lodge. And it seemed the theory was plausible enough that Freemasons were actually forbidden from partaking in the investigation from that point forward. So, a rather large amount of police officers, investigators, prosecutors, judges, etc., were now not allowed to take part in the investigation. Wow, that many? How strange. Speaking of Duckenfield, he was sued by private prosecution alongside another officer in the year 2000. Despite admitting to lying about the causes of the disaster in the immediate aftermath, he was found not guilty on account of a hung jury. So, Duckenfield got away with it. Except, lol no, because he was sued again in 2017 for 95 counts of manslaughter by gross negligence. The case was long and grueling, dragging on for over 2 years, with the result being not guilty. He was found not guilty because, of course he fucking was. It's not like we live somewhere where we can actually hold the police accountable for their own fuck-ups. Though, despite Duckenfield's wriggling out of consequences, there was indeed a reckoning for some of those responsible after the Hip's debut, with Sheffield Wednesday FC club secretary Graham Macro getting convicted under the Safety at Sports Grounds Act. How long did he get put away for? Not a fucking clue. I mean, for fuck's sake, the fact that he was the only one of those guys to actually get convicted is infuriating enough as it is, but, at least give us the catharsis of a number. But, regardless, will it be enough? No, probably not, but at least it's better than nothing. One of the most shocking things about the aftermath of the Hillsborough disaster is how few of the people responsible for it were actually held responsible. So, where does that leave us today? What is the legacy of the Hillsborough disaster? Well, the only way that I can really describe the tone and sentiment around it is, it's the football fans' equivalent to Ruby Ridge or Waco. A tragic loss of human life that was caused by the police that was not only completely avoidable, but also remembered for its governmental murkiness alongside its victims. The survivors of that day live on with the past on their shoulders, forever doubting the institutions that failed them and their loved ones. It was a tragedy that could have been avoided if the police just did their jobs, which is sadly a very common trend in this country.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube! Everybody just subscribe!